So I want to start just by reading a passage that I think kind of captures, this is where I need three hands. Yeah. So I think it just kind of captures the moment. In the book, if you've looked at it, it's extensively documented with case studies as well as information. And it's really geared toward professionals as well as gay men. But this is one of the descriptions of a client. Brian lay on the floor of his condominium, naked and unable to force his body to move. He became acutely aware of the air conditioning while staring toward the ceiling. He could hear a strange whistling coming through them. And while his rational mind told him it was simply the flow of air, he was certain he also heard strains of voices and music woven into the stream of sound. He was convinced that there was a camera placed just behind the vent, silently observing everything he did, including the hours of pornography that played silently on his laptop, on the carpet next to him, his endless masturbation, even the nameless tricks that he'd been using his meth. Brian wasn't sure who the men were, or if they were even gone, or what they might have stolen. As he lay on the floor, Brian's brain seemed to be thinking faster than his body could move. He was aware of a slight tremor in his hands, over which he had no control. He was aware that his nose was impossibly dry, and his side ached above his kidneys. His penis was raw from hours of masturbation. He couldn't remember the last time he'd drunk water, and he knew that he hadn't even eaten for days. His brain seemed supercharged and hyper-alert to everything in the room. It overwhelmed its capacity to process the massive information his senses were collecting. Brian was convinced that the silent camera and yet to be discovered microphones were conveying his every movement to the police. He was certain they would burst through the door at any moment. He recalled another time he'd been convinced the police were just outside the door. On that occasion, he vacated his apartment and moved to the bathhouse for several days. Even there, he knew he had been followed and stayed in his cubicle the entire time. Now, as he lay on the floor, he tried to remember when that was and what time that had been. And that is unfortunately a pretty common scenario with the paranoia, the drug use, the sort of out-of-control behavior. And we see that just an awful lot. And I really want to focus on solutions today, but I want to sort of lay out some of the damage that does happen. And I think Brian's case really illustrates that really well. You know, methamphetamine works on a part of the brain called the limbic system and works on dopamine. The limbic system is the reward center of the brain where we get bursts of dopamine for things that make us feel good. So food, comfort, pastas, carbohydrates, sex, nicotine, and amphetamines. Amphetamines are like naturally made to just fit perfectly into that limbic system and really teach it how to be addicted. And I do a lot of training for professionals. I don't have my PowerPoint, but I have a slide that shows the amount of relative dopamine discharge from things like sex and nicotine, and they're all, lower level. Even the cocaine is higher level. Methamphetamine is 4 times the amount of dopamine released than cocaine. And I think people ask, what's the difference between cocaine and meth? Well, that's one of the differences. And so what happens is this tremendous rush of dopamine that makes people feel fantastic at first. It's a wonderful antidepressant. And it's the most amazing sex people have had, and they, I think from that moment on, are chasing that experience over and over again. And it's very elusive, of course. And what happens when, just like cocaine will sit on the dopamine receptor, so it keeps the dopamine from being reabsorbed, and that makes people feel good. Cocaine will wash away in 15 minutes. Methamphetamine sits there for 9 or 10 hours. And that's why the high is so much longer. But it also destroys that dopamine transporter system so that it actually eats through the receptor, which means that gradually people are destroying all their neural pathways to provide dopamine, which is why people talk about Suicide Tuesdays after a weekend of partying, and why there's such a long, difficult recovery. If we look at scans of people's brains, the dopamine system takes 12 to 18 months to get back to normal. So people can be fighting week after week, month after month for sobriety and not feeling any better, still feeling that hopelessness, still feeling that despair. And it just takes that long for the brain to rework, which has implications, I think, for the recovery piece. What it does, though, it increases confidence, energy, sexual desire, sexual stamina. A lot of my clients are gay men. I had a 70-year-old client this year using meth for the first time. But a lot of them are not just younger guys. They're 40s, 50s, and they're people feeling a little disconnected, a little bit less sexual, less attractive, less energetic. And suddenly with methamphetamine, it all wipes that away. And it just gives them this kind of artificial boost of confidence that is, as I say, highly addictive and really quite devastating. I'm going to deploy my third arm to find the page. Through the book, there's different quotes from clients, but I wanted to read this because I thought it was pertinent to that, what I was just describing. At 50, I don't exist socially in the gay community anymore. Having a connection has made me cool, albeit temporarily, but it's better than being invisible when I want to get laid. And I think that goes a lot with the methamphetamine experience. So what does meth do in terms of sexual behavior? It leads to high-risk sexual behavior. There's studies in ways that we don't understand. It leads to more unprotected receptive anal intercourse, which of course is the most dangerous kind. People using meth don't use condoms it's the last thing on their mind. And interestingly, there's research, even among heterosexuals, they have more unprotected receptive anal intercourse. We don't know why, but that seems to be a phenomena with methamphetamine. So a lot of these high-risk sexual activities, multiple partners, other needs are set aside, as we saw in the case of Brian, not drinking. I have people in a hospital for kidney damage because they don't drink, they don't eat. And just the other thing that I find really interesting and damaging is in ways that, again, we don't totally understand, methamphetamine affects our ability to have empathy. And so it's interesting, methamphetamine, as you probably know, is used not just in the gay community, but it's used in the straight world, mostly for energy and for weight loss. But among the heterosexual community, they figure between 25 and 50% of child abuse is related to methamphetamine, where parents just detach. They objectify their kids and they're just disconnected. And there's an interesting study that was done here at NYU about methamphetamine's effect on empathy, and they showed visuals of a man having different expressions on his face: happy, sad, disappointed, angry. And if you ask a meth user using meth to interpret those, they can't see the difference. They're disconnected from that. And anybody have a guess of what the meth user did assume the expression was? The expression on the face, no matter what, if it could be a happy face, it could be a sad face, but a meth user typically interpreted it as hostility. Yeah, that was the really interesting find. And that's, I think, another thing, an implication for recovery, is that hostility piece. There's another aspect about dopamine. They say it has a short shelf life, which means that if whatever causes us to be excited today is not going to be as exciting tomorrow. So, and that's true of pornography, by the way, too. So you see an escalation. People need more and more, maybe more exotic, rougher, darker, more activity to kind of boost the dopamine. And there's some physiological reasons for that. The brain, if you think of methamphetamine hyper-stimulating the brain, it's like the radio being blasted at you, and your brain literally turns it down. It gets rid of some dopamine receptors because it's so trying to compensate. And so when you take away the methamphetamine, people have fewer dopamine receptors, and that contributes to this feeling of kind of hopelessness. And then the most damaging thing that my message is talking about is this fusion of meth and sex. So dopamine is what binds things together. So when there's a expression about what you do together fuses together. So when people practice dopamine and sex together, the two become bound in your brain. Your brains are very efficient, and it sort of doesn't bother to differentiate it after a while. So the implication of that is when somebody finally gets clean, their sexual desire goes out the window as well. And that was the initial problem I had way back when, with 12, 13, 14 years ago, with clients who were coming in who had absolutely no sexual desire, and they couldn't figure out why. And it was their healing, their recovery was about kind of recreating that connection with people. So and with that, I want to kind of switch over to recovery, which is a tough thing. You know, there's a lot of triggers. Dopamine connects all these triggers, whether it's a sound, a street, a name, a smell. I have a lot of clients who get into Crystal Meth Anonymous, which is a great program, a needed program. But if they walk into a room and they've tricked with half the people in the room, that can be arousing or triggering. Just walking down seeing other gay men can be triggering. So it's a matter of really learning to handle the stimulus and the controls, all those triggers. Another issue with recovery, I think, is some of the emotions. You know, meth is a great way to numb numb feelings. It's a great antidepressant. It's a great way to escape feelings. And so if we take meth away, I think it's incumbent on us to kind of figure out what to do to help men deal with that, because there's often a lot of anger, there's a lot of grief, a tremendous amount of grief, and a lot of shame. And I think if I ask my clients, do you experience shame? Almost everyone would say no. But if we sort of drill down a little bit, it's there. And I think there's a lot of internalized homophobia at some level, and some issues that they had long before they ever picked up meth. And I want to make clear, though, these are factors that can lead to meth use. But I think that the primary goal gay men have with using meth is connection. And it's not pathology, really. It's not that they're burdened by too much shame or depression, although those are issues that do come up in recovery. But I think it's that need for connection. And methamphetamine gives that artificial state of connection that people can quickly become dependent on. There's all kinds of other co-occurring issues. I think pornography addiction, sex addiction goes well with methamphetamine. The two go hand in hand. And there's a lot of emotional pain that goes as well. And I just want to read one section in here. One factor common in both sex addicts and those ingesting meth is that both use sex as a mood changer to mask emotional pain. Sex ultimately becomes less about erotic desire and more directed toward avoiding emotional pain through the manipulation of pain-killing effects of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. And I think if you talk to a lot of meth users, ultimately it's not even so much about the sex anymore, it's just kind of getting back to feeling normal. The major challenge of recovery from either or both sex addiction and meth addiction is learning how to experience in a healthy way the various emotions that bubble up once the numbing effects have worn off. Both sex and meth addiction can be conceptualized as intimacy disorders. They compensate for the inability of an individual to adequately bond in intimate relationships, and that's the challenge of recovery, by the way, and indeed may cause or worsen any intimacy concerns that are present. The ultimate treatment goal for sex addiction, as well as meth addiction, is mastering the experience of forming, enduring, and trusting intimate connections. And I think it's all about that intimacy and connection that men are seeking and are often challenged. And I would add to that a connection with oneself. And I think it really has to start by knowing yourself and believing in yourself. And I think a lot of people are struggling with that when they first come in seeking recovery. The most common barriers preventing addicts from achieving these intimate connections include shame, the inability to self-regulate emotions, and not maintaining sexual boundaries. And that really goes hand in hand with meth addiction. I've outlined about half the book is the recovery process. The trajectory is interesting. For those of you in healthcare, you may know that methamphetamine or amphetamine addiction is not considered worthy of inpatient treatment. It doesn't meet criteria because there's no detox like there would be for heroin. Although there is a physical detox, there's certainly a psychological detox. But so you can't go inpatient. And actually that turns out to be a good thing, because one of the effects of meth is that it impairs our so-called visual memory, which is our ability to understand words on the posters. It's just kind of, early on, it's kind of a blur. In the 12 steps and 12 traditions, not much going on there. But the visual part of our brains with meth addiction is very heightened. And so people are very prone to visual stimulation, which is why porn is so popular. I remember back in the 80s, cocaine functions very much the same way. I was working in a treatment center. We didn't know any of this. And we would show treatment videos of like people smoking cocaine and crack and all this stuff. And the clients would get nuts because they were being triggered constantly by our educational videos. We had a similar case. We had a town hall meeting for meth in Fort Lauderdale last year. And unbeknownst to me, the local paper ran a cover picture of someone injecting. And that also is extremely triggering for people. I have guys that can't even go to the doctor to get their blood drawn without being triggered. So yeah, I think being very conscious of that visual piece is incredibly important.